My guest today is William Nordhaus, and his new book is The Spirit of Green, The Economics of Collisions and Contagions in a Crowded World. Bill is the winner of the 2018 Nobel Prize in Economics. He's the Sterling Professor of Economics and Professor in the School of Environment at Yale University. His many books include The Climate Casino, Risk, Uncertainty, and Economics for a Warming World, and A Question of Balance, Weighing the Options on Global Warming Policies. He lives in New Haven, Connecticut. This is the man. He, of course, won the Nobel Prize for good reason because of his work in environmental economics. That is, nudging people to do things that are good for the environment, for clean air, water, and so forth, when it's in their own best interests to do so economically. We already do this in many, many areas of life. So we cover all these different examples of how this works in different areas. And then at the end, I ask him to make the case for why conservatives, Republicans, and so forth should be on board with this. And I think he nails it. Really, economically, this is really the right thing to do. Selfishly, greedily, not to mention, of course, as a collective action problem, it's better to have clean air and water in a sustainable environment. And so we go through all the different steps that need to happen. Not that many, not that difficult. We can get there. So with that, please enjoy my conversation with William Nordhaus. And did your speech you gave, was that your based on the research for which you won the prize on environmental economics?
Yeah, it was on climate. There are actually two events there are lots of them, but the two main. One is your Nobel speech, which is in a beautiful auditorium, and is just present your work beautifully. It's beautifully done. It's actually, you can see it online. And then a shorter one, which is in a way more interesting, there's a banquet speech, and so they give one person from each of the different areas gives a 2-minute speech on whatever. So I talked about the actually a little bit what's in the book, our legacy to our grandchildren, but of not so much what we do in terms of leave our automobiles in our houses, but our institutions and our public property and our public goods.
Yeah, when I read your book, I was thinking about the research I was doing when I was writing The Moral Arc about the future of moral progress. What's next? And one of the big ones is obviously the right for future generations to have a livable, sustainable environment to live in, a planet that continues on indefinitely.
Yes. Yes, I would say one of the things that is in the book, there's a chapter on exo-civilizations.
Yeah, I love that.
Where I talk, it was completely new for me, but I spent maybe a month or so studying and researching on it. So this question is, there's a kind of Elon Musk, whom I admire greatly, by the way, but he has his Mars project, and where you can buy a one-way ticket to Mars. I don't know if you know that these are one-way tickets. But anyway,
you're not coming back.
And then look, well, you have to book the return travel with someone else. It's sort of like going out west in the 19th century on your stagecoach. There are no round trips. And as I looked at it, I looked at the different analogs and Biosphere 2 in Arizona and the space station and life in Antarctica. It became clear that exo-civilizations, as I call them, are a long way in the future. And when I talk to people, I say, one of the things, if you live on Mars, that's going to make it less attractive than Earth is there will be no pets, because the atmosphere is so dangerous. You have to be protected from all the asteroids and the UV, that unless you can have a pet walking around in a piece of armor and a spacesuit, which you can't pet very well, it's not going to be much fun to leave your dogs and your cats and your guinea pigs at home.
Yeah, the analogy I hear is, go to the top of Mount Everest, where the best climbers in the world with oxygen only stay for like 15 minutes. And that would be paradise compared to being on Mars.
Yeah. Well, or the other thing is, if you think of Antarctica, which is a pretty tough place to live, Mars is much less hospitable than Antarctica. It's like 60 degrees colder just to start with, and no water. Okay, anyway.
Of course, the idea is that they're gonna geoengineer the planet and pump out CO2 gas and create a greenhouse effect until it gets to a nice toasty 70 something, and then turn it off. What could go wrong there?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Well, that's an interesting.
I think it's a long ways in the future.
That's a lot of. I mean, to take all that CO2 to Mars is a lot of space travel. I know where we can get it. We can get it from the atmosphere. But anyway, this is only we can only see we can only see a couple of days in the future. So who knows what will happen in 100 or 500 years?
Yeah, that's right. But I did want to ask you about that because you're an economist. That if you were to set up a Mars colony, presumably we solve the the physical living problems. What kind of government should we have? What kind of economic system? I mean, would we look at what we've done in the past couple centuries here on Earth and go, this one works, this one doesn't work, let's try that? Or maybe Musk's economic team will come up with something completely different, or the NASA team or whoever, a completely different form of governance than democracy in a regulated economy.
That's a really interesting question. I think what we tend to do is take our institutions with us, sort of the way the people do. They bring them to America, take them to Australia, take them to different places. So I think we'd probably just take our institutions. So if we take our institutions, the Chinese would take their institutions. So you might have a Chinese, which was quite autocratic, and a Western colony, which was quite democratic, such as it is. One of the things we learn about institutions is they're very hard. You can't invent them. They're not like cars or mousetraps. Institutions evolve, and the idea that you can just devise something from scratch is a complete fantasy. So I think we'd probably just take our institutions with us, and maybe we'd have to adapt them to the atmosphere and the environment. But it's a really good, really interesting question.
It is. No, I've been thinking and reading about this, writing about this, and of course, I don't know the answer either. I think you're right. It goes back to the first conservative intellectual, Thomas, his name is spacing out on me, that wrote on the French Revolution. Yeah, Burke. Yeah, yes, Edmund Burke. He supported the American Revolution because they were doing it incrementally, legally, carefully, and trying to be peaceful about it. Whereas the French Revolution was just tear the whole thing down and start from scratch. And we saw what happened there.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. I think Burkean conservatism is underappreciated in our land. And those are two good, where we exported the British model to the Americas not with all of its flaws as well, flaws of slavery and other things, but some of its good points. Whereas the French didn't export much of anything in terms of politics, except the metric system, which was a good export.
We should have had that. I don't know why we didn't adopt that. That's a different question. I'm not a conservative, but I'm worried about the pull to the far right from people like Trump supporters and so on, away from this more centrist conservatism that does have a lot of value to it. And the moment you kind of step in that direction, the people on the far left say, well, you're just an autocratic, neo-Nazi or whatever. Well, no, there's some, barely right of center conservatives that want to preserve our institutions and then change the ones that need to be changed gradually. And they're being kind of outshouted by the people on the far right.
Yeah, well, I think Burkean conservatism is to preserve is really a kind of humility about creating new institutions. It's how difficult it is. And there's an interesting example of this from public health, which is the cholera conventions. And there actually took, I think, 6 cholera conventions over 6 decades before we actually reached an international agreement on how to control it. And that was partly because we didn't understand cholera, and international conventions are so difficult. But it's a beautiful example of how difficult it is when you start from scratch to invent these new institutions. And finally, we have something which eventually evolved into the WHO, which is, I think, a remarkable institution given all of the difficulties of international institutions.
Well, it's like the problem Eleanor Roosevelt had getting everybody to sign on to a universal declaration of human rights. Finally they had to just say, all right, we're just going to close our eyes and sign it, and no one's going to argue about why this one and why not that one or whatever, because they'll never get there.
Yeah, well, that's the whole global governance is a whole other issue from national governance, and part of the issues that I talk about a little in the book, but are not so appreciated in the climate change debate, is a necessity for changing the way we think of governance of climate treaties. And I think we've gone down the wrong path so far by thinking that we can get to strong climate agreements through voluntary actions of nations, and we need something that has more teeth than voluntary agreements. So that this global governance is actually one of the key issues that we need to deal with in this issue of dealing with what I call the bumps and collisions and contagions of the modern world.
Yeah, so you have a whole section on the tragedy of the commons and collective action problems, and how do we navigate those kind of problems when one country says we don't want to do that, and as you point out, poorer countries they want to be industrialized, they want to get there, they want to live like we live. So it's hardly fair for us to say, no, you can't do that. You have to stay poor.
Well, one of the things I've tried to do in this project, which took about a decade, was really conceptualize how we think about this public sphere and collective action. We have our analyses and theories and treatises on how we deal with the private sector and market economies with their strengths and weaknesses, and the market sector with its strengths and weaknesses. But conceptualizing our collective activities is actually, there's a weaker analytical and theoretical and discursive description of those than you would think. And so part of what I tried to do is to think more broadly in different areas, not just climate change and pollution, but also innovation, global governance, national governments, local governance, how to think about the collective action. What are its limits? What are its strengths? What are its weaknesses? Where should we use it? Where should we not use it? And one of the conclusions is the most difficult of all are these global ones because of the poor governance. But we have great strengths of national governance. I mean, we have some real success stories in how we've dealt with issues. I mean, as different as the income tax on the one hand and dealing with pollution of sulfur on the other. I mean, there's some real success stories in collective action when we use new tools and we think about things carefully and we use goodwill in trying to devise these new instruments and institutions.
Yeah, you've got this discussion of the Kuznets environmental curve in which the environment has to get worse before it gets better. That is to say, for people to care about the environment, they have to have at least 3 square meals a day and a house to live in, and the basics of life. And to get that, you need power. Cities are basically energy capture devices, and you need power for that. And is there a way around that? I mean, nuclear or solar, or that you could just make this leap in like 10 years and not have to pollute the environment if you're a poor country.
Yeah, the idea of the Kuznets curve, as you said, things get worse before they get better, which is actually not universally true, but there's something to it. I mean, when you're living in a cave, you're not going to be polluting very much. On the other hand, you're not going to be eating very much. And as you move to industrial activity, particularly to cities, and you start up industries, manufacturing industries particularly, then you're going to be burning things, and you're going to be having these side effects of industrial activity, and that's when things get worse. But as you say, as you get wealthier, you can put on pollution control devices. Take such a simple thing as washing coal. I mean, not many people know that actually coal is dirty. It's the first thing you can do. You can clean a lot of it off. Just wash it before you burn it, and that cleans a lot of the junk out just right there. You not quite a garden hose, but you can think of it as a garden hose. So you can do very inexpensive things and you can make a lot of progress, and then you do more expensive things and make more progress. But that's why things get better. And as you it's half of it is that you don't have the resources to do it as a poor country. But the other half of it is actually things are getting much better. And if you look at where a poor country is today relative to a different poor country 20, 40, 60 years ago, actually the technologies are much cleaner. I mean, a cell phone is different. A cell phone is different from the technology that we use. Solar power, which is in a small village, is different from a power station. So technology improves things as wealth. And then there's the story of the horse and the disappearance of the horse, which was the greatest contributor to clean cities other than clean water, was when the horses disappeared from the streets of New York and millions of tons of various offshoots of the horse, the urine and the manure were disappeared from the streets of New York when the automobile arrived. And now everybody hates the automobile, but in 1900, everybody loved it because it cleaned our cities.
Right. So it's a never-ending cycle of changing technologies that become ever cleaner. What I haven't been able to get a straight answer on, so I'd like your opinion, is on the one hand, I hear environmentalists say we can absolutely have sustainable energy, solar, wind, geoengineering, and so on, enough to provide all the energy that humanity needs. Skeptics of this that I talk to and read, they say we're not even remotely close to that. You'd have like the entire land surface would have to be solar panels, and it still wouldn't be enough. And therefore, we need nuclear or something like that. What is your sense of sustainable green technology for enough energy for everybody?
Well, they're both right, because on the one hand, 80% of our energy use is fossil fuels now. We're not going to replace that all overnight. I mean, I'm going to burn down my house, get rid of my cars, take a bicycle wherever I go, and that means I don't go anywhere. I won't be flying anymore. So I won't be doing that tomorrow. So obviously, we can't replace all of the fossil fuels in every country and every industry overnight. But if you look in the long run, 20 years, 40 years, 60 years, 100 years, it's hard to know, we have made remarkable improvements in our energy technologies. People think of solar and wind, but also batteries. I mean, simple things like improvements in batteries, so you can generate. Obviously, solar and wind are depend on the time of day and the weather and so on. So you can't. We need our power at night, and the sun isn't shining at night, so we need batteries to store it. And as batteries has become more efficient, vastly more efficient over the last 2 decades, that allows our renewable power to be stored and used. And then in my view, this is a little bit a fantasy, or let's say futuristic. Is we need much better low cost transmission. We need superconducting transmission, and when we have superconducting transmission, we can generate power in the waterfalls of Greenland and distribute it around the world for nothing. But that's in the future.
I'm not sure what you're talking about. Wireless? You mean just send this sounds like the original Tesla.
No. It's a superconductivity. It just means you can transmit something to someplace else without any resistance. So you don't. Otherwise, you lose power as you go.
Oh, right.
So we started out with superconductivity at essentially 0 degrees. I mean, like minus Fahrenheit, and now it's gradually crept up to close to room temperature. But it's still an exotic temperature technology, but it's getting better. But I mean, you do that with renewable power plus batteries plus superconductivity, and basically you've solved the world's energy problem. But that's
I'm
probably
still waiting
before
for
Mars.
Those Tesla wall batteries that I'd like to have at my house, but they're $15,000 each, and I would need 3 of them to store so enough power that I need if the sun goes down. That's $45,000. So some of my neighbors have them. They got them on some. There was some program for a while where you could get them for free if you were in a low economic income area or something like that. Anyway, but that ended, I guess. Well, here in California, where I live, they just passed that legislation that all cars have to be electric by, I forget when, 2035 or 2040 or something like that. Will that help if like every single car and truck in the United States was electric? How much would that stabilize the CO2 gas increases?
Not much by itself. I mean, first place, we're only a small part of the world, and transportation, automobiles are only a small part of our CO2 emissions. So by itself, it won't. But you chip at it here. I mean, we talked about electric power. Now we talk about automobiles. Next, we have to talk about airplanes and how the airplanes are going to fly and so forth. But we're moving in that direction, but we're not moving. We do have to realize we're not moving very quickly. And part of, I would say, the central reason we're not moving very quickly is we're not serious about putting a price on carbon. I would say the big shortcoming of our policies, and I'd say the moderate shortcomings of policies of other countries, is we don't really want to recognize that we should be paying for our emissions of CO2 the way we pay for oil and shoes and food and other things, because it is and it's a scarce thing that should be charged for. And that's the thing that's actually necessary if we're going to make a transition to a low carbon economy.
I always like Thomas Sowell's definition of economics as the study of the use of scarce resources which have alternative uses. And therefore, there are no perfect solutions, just trade-offs. So you have to give things up if you want something else.
Yeah, economics is the science of choice.
Yeah.
In one word, science of choice.
Science of choice, yeah. Well, right. The again, back to the collective action problem, getting people to go along with what doesn't seem like is their problem. So what you're talking about there with pollution is, a negative externality. Well, I think we're all comfortable with a corporation dumping chemical waste into the local river. That's not cool because the river's coming down to my house. And so I think we all recognize, we're not going to allow that. So, but what's the analogy to take it from there to, well, you're dumping CO2 gas into the atmosphere and it floats over to some other country, and the manufacturer says, not my problem. It's just the air. So how do we get people to think about the atmosphere like a local river?
Well, maybe another analogy would be like it's CO2 is invisible. You can't taste it. You can't see it. It just floats around the air. And you say, well, maybe a little bit like a coronavirus. You can't see it. You can't smell it. You can't hear it. You can't taste it. But it's deadly. And the same way, analogously, but through a different mechanism, the CO2 is deadly because it causes wildfires. It causes sea level rise. It causes the spread of vector-borne diseases. So it's in a same kind of invisible way, not so dramatic, not so short term. It doesn't happen overnight. You're not going to get sick in 5 days. It might take longer, but it's actually much more pervasive and much harder to prevent. There's no vaccine for the CO2 problem. That's the difference between that and the pandemic, but it's just as deadly as the coronavirus.
Yeah, here I think we're running up against the same problem of getting people to accept the theory of evolution. Just intuitively, I never see any animals becoming other animals. I don't see species evolving. What are you talking about? 10,000 years, 100,000 years? I mean, this doesn't even register in my intuitive brain. It's the same kind of problem. Global warming over the decades, centuries. Yeah, maybe. I don't see this happening. It was cold the other day. What happened to global warming? So you get that kind of weather versus the climate, short-term versus long-term thinking.
Well, one thing, I mean, if you want to talk about evolution, again, going back to the pandemic, we see this virus evolving over time with different variants, and some more dangerous, some not. Maybe one. I mean, the history of these viruses is that usually what happens is they evolve to become less dangerous. So this is and so the common cold is just an old dangerous virus that became a less dangerous virus now. So I mean that's evolution, just as the rest of the pandemic operates in lightning speed, it operates much more rapidly than evolution of large mammals like us. And but it's the same mechanism at work. It's survival and it's finding niches and discovering things getting bigger brains, learning how to do things, or causing more damage.
This is the problem.
But I mean, look, science.
Richard Dawkins calls this middle land, that we evolved in this middle land in the savannas of Africa, where we, change happens, sort of slowly at a human scale over days or weeks or months or whatever. And we see things of a certain middling size and middling speed and middling time. And so the idea of like the climate changing over the next 1,000 years, it's like, whatever. I don't see it. It just doesn't register in a kind of an intuitive way.
Yeah. Well, I think that's true. But on the other hand, if you go back, I remember back when people didn't know anything about it except for a few geophysicists, and you did survey the American people in 1960 and say, how big a problem do you think climate change is? You probably get zero. Or else they think climate change was maybe thunderstorms or something like that. But if you explain what it is, and that's increased now, and we have probably at least half of, maybe more of the American people who now think it's real, think it's caused by humans, and think it's trouble. And they look around, they see what's happening right away. I mean, the most dramatic examples are these wildfires. Hurricanes also will do it for you. So it's with us. It's with us right today. So I think the immediacy of it, it's not just in the future. I mean, it used to be you say, well, that's going to happen next year, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. But now you say, it's happening right now. You can see it. If you live in California, as you know, you could see it.
I live in high fire country up here. I'm in the mountains above Santa Barbara, and I can't get fire insurance. I had to go through the California Fair Plan. These fires, yeah.
I'm from New Mexico, and we have a little cabin which is surrounded by ponderosa pines, and it's just sitting there with a little sign up saying "Burn me down," and because it's just going to happen one of these days. But that's that's what's happening to us.
I think of the whole climate science debate in 5 questions: Is the Earth getting warmer? Is it primarily human caused? How much warmer is it going to get? Is it an existential threat? And what should we do about it? So, reading your book, clearly you agree global warming is real. It's primarily human caused. It's going to get warmer. But here, then, how far out do you read the error bars for estimating how much warmer it's going to get? What's the latest data on that? Let's say 5 years, 10 years, 50 years, 100 years from now, because that was going to determine to what extent it's a problem and therefore what we should do about it.
Yeah. So let's go to 2100, where we have multiple studies, multi-model studies. We have climate models, we have economic models, we have different kinds of techniques. And so the best guess there is on the trajectory we are now with a little policy, it's going to be about 4 degrees C above pre-industrial levels. So that's roughly 7+ degrees F. It'll be more in the mid-continental areas. It'll be more in the high latitudes, be less in the ocean areas just because of the differences. The error bar on that, say plus or minus 1%. I mean, it depends what you mean by error bar, but let's say 56, say 50%, it'll be between 3 and 5, maybe 60%, something like that. There are no model I know that say nothing's going to happen. I mean, there's really nothing. There are a couple of non-modelers that say nothing's going to happen, but if you actually look at all these models, there are like dozens of models using different techniques. I'm talking about the geophysical models around the world. Every major country has at least one of these models, and they're all different. I mean, some are large scale, some are small scale. They're on supercomputers. They're very fine resolution. They're very broad resolution. Different principles, different initial, all kinds of things. And they're different. They give different answers, but they don't give zero. None of them give zero. None of them give close to zero. So, and what we've seen basically what's actually happened is pretty much on track with what the models were projecting 30 years ago. So it's not as if you go back and say, okay, let's look at what this IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel, said in its first report. Look what it says for now, or look what it says for 20 years from now. It's pretty much on track. So I think this is really good and mature science. I mean, this science goes back to 1896. It's not brand new stuff. and we've evolved as in all of our thinking, and we know a lot more now, and we have better. And we didn't have computerized modeling then.
Because
We
I
do
publish
that.
a magazine called
So
Skeptic, the climate skeptics email me and say, you should be skeptical of global warming. Those models, the latest I've been hearing about, those models, they get whatever they plug into them. They're not consistent. So your point is that it's not one model that's telling this. You have multiple lines of inquiry, multiple lines of modeling, all pointing to the same conclusion. Not like these guys are all meeting on the weekends to get their story straight because they want to destroy American capitalism or something like this, as the conspiracy theory goes.
yeah, yeah, and also, I mean, they're Chinese modelers, they're Russian modelers, they're not all American, and they're not all. That's just an absurd idea. That they're getting together to conspire to destroy capitalism. I think what they are concerned about the earth, and a lot of them are. They may be environmentalists. They may not be environmentalists. They may just be computer programmers, for all I know. But I would just say one other thing. In addition to different models, you have sensitivity analyses where you try to find out what are the issues, what are the parameters we don't know about, and you get the same point. You get uncertainties because there are a lot of uncertainties about what's going to happen to emissions. Are we going to have a pandemic? What's going to shut down the economy again? What's going to happen over the next few years? What's going to happen to population growth? So there are uncertainties, but you still get the same conclusion. I think this is a long argument. We've been having this since the beginning of time in terms of climate change time, and some of it has been funded by people who are anti-environmental policies. Some has been funded by people who are conservatives and don't like mucking with what they view as mucking with the market. But I think if you look at the people who don't have a political interest in this, I think it's pretty clear. I mean, there's not really a serious debate here about the science on this.
Has it always been this politicized? If you go back to say the 90s, 80s, 70s?
No, it's a kind of interesting trajectory how things start in science and then get politicized. I mean, this is not the first time. Another interesting example was sulfur pollution, and which was going along and just chugging along, and people were trying to clean up the air in Pittsburgh and other cities, and it wasn't the steel companies didn't want to clean it up, but it's just that's the battle between the companies and the public interest, and that's the standard stuff. But then when the acid rain controversy grew in the Reagan administration, then it became politicized. I mean, that was the first example in the U.S., and then that was a kind of model for how the people who are the opponents could politicize something, and then get the politics on their side in addition to just their lobbying to prevent change. And but it's not everywhere. It's primarily been in acid rain and now climate change. But there are lots of areas where we haven't politicized drinking water yet, and cigarettes, which were politicized, now become pretty depoliticized. So it kind of comes and goes. But part of it also is. I'm sorry.
Well, I was going to say,
I'll just say one thing.
Please go ahead.
I should say one thing. Cigarettes is an interesting example because you can see the evolution in people's thinking because it goes so far back. It goes back more than 60 years now, where they saw the battle over cigarettes, and you could see that the cigarette company's advertisement was really affecting public views on the dangers of smoking. Used to be, you go back to the earliest surveys, 80% of people who didn't smoke thought it was dangerous, and something like 30% of people who smoked thought it wasn't dangerous. But what happened over time was that converged, and now even people who smoke think it's dangerous, which is actually a big change from the early. And it's the cumulative effect of people dying, lung cancer, information, warning packages, and just sort of beating up on the people who are the deniers of this. In this case, mainly the cigarette companies. So that's a lesson that these things take a long time to really change public attitudes.
Yeah, here I recommend Naomi Oreskes' book, Merchants of Doubt, in which she and her co-author track the whole cigarette debate through 50s and 60s and 70s. But then they show how the climate skeptics, so-called deniers or whatever you want to call them, use the same tactics as the cigarette deniers. In fact, sometimes they use the same people. They hired the same lobbyists to write the same kind of advertising jingles to sow doubt, like the jury is still out, or we need more science, or that sort of thing. And it's a striking parallel to how it's almost like a formula of how to deny a particular scientific theory.
Yeah, and I think that's right. I think that's a really interesting book. Oreskes and Conrad, I think, is the co-author, and
Conway.
it does go through. It does go Conway. It does go through the history of that. It also tells a sulfur story and the acid rain story, and how it's this is a formula for influencing public opinion, and it's a very useful one, very useful in history.
Pinker also makes the point in Enlightenment Now that when climate science got bundled with Al Gore because of his film An Inconvenient Truth, and this won the Academy Award and a bunch of prizes and so on, it then became a left-wing liberal cause or problem, and therefore when conservatives hear climate change or global warming, their brains autocorrect to anti-capitalism, anti-market, and government regulation, and big government, and socialism. And what has CO2 gas got to do with socialism? Well, that's kind of that causal chain there, bundling it with politics.
Well, this is an interesting example of American exceptionalism, because this is not true in most other countries. I mean, we have gotten ourselves into, I won't say we, the Republican Party has gotten itself into a kind of rut where it's advocating sort of anti-science themes, anti-science policies, anti-science science, so to speak. But this isn't true in other countries. I mean, this is right now really taken hold in the U.S. in a very unusual way. You can look at conservatives in the UK. I mean, conservatives in the political conservatives in the UK, on the continent, even in Canada, in Japan. I don't know how you characterize the government of China, but these are places where kind of across the board, it's not that everybody has equal enthusiasm, but nobody's sitting there saying, "Oh, this is all a hoax. Let's just abandon it. Let's just get out of the." I mean, Canada's a good example. They've got a very strong carbon tax initiative now, and they're just as divided politically as the United States, both regionally and politically. But they haven't gotten into the business where the conservatives decide to kind of march backwards to the 18th century in terms of their views of science and politics.
Yeah, I've noticed that last week there were some people saying, I've got vaccinated, but I'm going to wear my mask anyway because I don't want people to think I'm a Republican. It's like, oh my God, is this what it's come down to? This is crazy.
Right. Well, that's another example of politicization, in which, why you politicize, why anyone would politicize masks is just beyond me. And why that's, the other thing that's puzzling to me is why is that conservative, in sort of traditional Burkean conservatism, to say that I don't want to wear a mask? I mean, that's sort of ignorant of what traditional conservatism is, which says I'm free as long as I don't hurt other people. But when I hurt other people, then we need to protect each other.
Or even norms, like everybody's used to signs in a restaurant that says no shoes, no shirt, no service. Well, the conservatives aren't saying, hey, I want the freedom to be able to go in shirtless and barefoot into a restaurant. No one says that. So why is a mask different? Yeah,
it's interesting how, taking up smoking again as an example, we're used to very strong policies on smoking. It's an interesting example now with respect to vaccination. Many institutions, colleges, universities, and other are asking themselves, should they require their employees to get vaccinated? And Yale has just decided to do that. But you'd say, well, okay, we don't allow smoking on campus. We don't allow smoking in our buildings. We don't allow smoking in our restaurants. Smoking, the SARS-CoV-2 killed, the COVID-19 killed more people last year than smoking did. Why do we think we could be more relaxed about restrictions on vaccination than we are on smoking? It's kind of a strange idea. So the smoking is it's a really good example how we've moved in this country, and this country actually is pretty advanced relative to other countries with respect to smoking. We're not sort of across the board. We're really quite advanced in the anti-smoking campaign in the United States. You still go to many countries and you sit in restaurants and some guy in the next table is, well, this not right this last year, but smoking a cigar and blowing it over your face as you eat your dessert, which is not such a pleasant experience. But in smoking, we've kind of gone from denialism to really very strong regulations to protect people, to protect the public health. And that's a beautiful example of how, but it's taken a long time. It's taken really a long time and a lot of work, a lot of people in different areas.
Yeah, that's a good analogy because it's clean air that we want, and smoke-filled air from cigarettes and cigars is not clean. And even if, because there was a debate about secondhand smoke, even if it turns out secondhand smoke is not deadly, let's just say that for a second, it still stinks, and I don't like it. I don't want to be in a nice restaurant smelling some guy's cigar on a plane, or you go into somebody's house that smokes, the house stinks. Right? The smoke is in the carpet and the drapes, and that's why hotels, don't do that anymore. Because even if you went in a smoke-free room, if they didn't change the drapes and carpets, the room stinks, right? So there's kind of a norm of civility. Like, I want a better society. Maybe an analogy would be interstate highways. When Eisenhower instituted the interstate highway system in the 1950s. I don't recall, well, I was too young, but, people saying, no, that should be privatized and, let the equivalent of today, a Bill Gates or a Jeff Bezos build the freeways and they can charge people or something. No, this is a kind of collective action problem that we all like because we get from point A to point B much faster on an interstate highway, and we all have to pay for that with taxes. Okay. So maybe it's just what you get used to.
The other thing about, just one more thing on smoking that's interesting is that one of the underutilized areas in this whole green movement is the use of green taxes, and the idea that you would use fiscal instruments and particularly taxes to slow particular activities, whether it's smoking or drinking or drugs or pollution or carbon emissions. And this is a whole uncharted area in public finance, the use of these, what I'll call green taxes or good taxes, and to let good taxes replace bad taxes being taxes on things we want to encourage, like people working, people saving. So smoking is a good example of how we've used fiscal instruments such as cigarette taxes to reinforce our other ways of influencing behavior. And we can use that in many, many more areas. We can use it obviously in pollution. We can use it for carbon taxes, and we can use it for congestion. We can use it for other kinds of areas as well. And there's a lot of revenue there that we're just letting go to waste because we don't use fiscal instruments. So this is what I call a kind of a holy trinity of green taxes, which is they can replace bad taxes, they can improve the environment, they can raise revenue for public purposes, and it's just sitting there unused.
So would an equivalent model be something like the government allows me to deduct the interest on my home loan, my mortgage, because the government wants more of us to be homeowners, and because I'm married, I get a tax break for being married and having a kid because the government says, well, we think it's good for people to be married and have families and raise kids for the future of our country, and so on. Maybe it's something along those lines that people are used to.
Yeah, but yeah. Well, I think except it's a penalty rather than a bonus. I mean that's why it's poses difficulties. But I mean there are other examples which are kind of closer when we used to use. We have these tax credits for renewables. We have tax credit for electrical vehicles and things like that. So these are things where we're trying to promote good behavior by getting people to buy electrical vehicles, as an example, or weatherize their homes, or buy windows, or other things, or in earlier days for corporations to invest in plant and equipment. Now there's a research and development tax credit as well. So those are things we're trying to encourage because we think they promote the public good. But we need to have the opposite of those as well. We need to have discouragements as well as encouragements.
So-called sin taxes.
Yeah, there's sin taxes, but there are also green taxes in the sense that I don't think we should view our carbon footprint as a sin. I mean, I think sin brings in a moralizing that I think we ought to get rid of. I mean, I don't want to go around everybody calculating. I mean, it's such a waste of our moral energy to calculate our carbon footprint all the time. You know, how much is it? How much am I spending to take a plane? How much am I doing my driving? Should I do a bicycle? Should I do this? Should I do that? I mean, we have limited moral energy. If we price it, then we don't have to do that because our carbon footprint is built into the prices of things we buy. And let's save our moral energy for war and peace, life and death, and love and hate, and things like that. We have lots of issues around to spend our moral energy on. It shouldn't be on measuring our carbon footprint. And it's an easy way to fix.
Walk us through how you do these long-term calculations of the cost, let's say by 2100 of our economy to bring CO2 gases down to lower the temperature by, let's say, it's only going to go up by 3 instead of 6 or whatever. You'll hear people like Bjorn Lomborg and others say, yes, global warming is real, it's human caused, and we should do something about it. But these economic models are going to cost like trillions of dollars, and they're only going to lower the temperature by, 0.1, 1/10 of 1%, and it's just not going to do it. It's not worth the money. How do you do those calculations?
Yeah. So the calculations for temperature limits are actually quite simple. Some other ones are more complicated, but those are quite simple. So basically what you do is you have two things. You have a climate model, which says if there's so much CO2 emissions, that will lead to so and so much warming. Okay. So what you do is you start by working back. You want to limit the temperature to 2 degrees or 3 degrees. How much is allowable emissions? So maybe it's so many billion of tons over the next whatever years. So that's something that's a relatively straightforward calculation that you can do in these climate models. It's sort of working backwards. If you want to get from here to there, how do you drive and how long does it take? But it's how much emissions can allow. That's step one. Then step two is you use your economic energy models to figure out how much it costs to reduce emissions by that much. And we've had energy models like this for 40 years or so, and there are many of them. All these give different answers, plus or minus a factor of 50% or something like that. But you get your answers. Then you work back and say, okay, this is what it costs. And each of those steps, there are many, many models which do that. Independent models. I mean, you have climate models developed by the geophysicists, and you have economic models developed by the national energy labs or the academics. And you put those two together, and you get what it costs, and you get what a price is necessary to get there. It actually sounds simple. It's a complicated calculation. It takes you a few years to do it, but once you figure out how to do it, it's pretty simple.
Do they take into account?
And, you can do it
like a growing economy.
I'll just say something. Let me just say one other thing. There's something I teach a class. I teach I teach macroeconomics, energy economics, climate economics, and I have my students do this. They take out an Excel spreadsheet, and we go through each of the steps, and they can figure it out. And they put their assumptions in, and it's after takes them about, I don't know, maybe a week full time, and they can do their own model, get their own answer. They don't and figure it out themselves.
Yes, I've been reading about this modern monetary theory, and how this is going to allow us to have something like a UBI or a massive infusion of capital into infrastructure improvements and so on. And like some of my conservatives friends are going, "Oh, this is pure magic. This can't work." But then, as I understand it, as long as the economy is growing pretty robustly, maybe 3 or 4% a year, then you could do something like that. So I was going to ask you about that in general, but then I just thought, would that change your model? Like if the economy grew 1% versus 4%, that would surely change your environmental economics model.
Well, let me say I wouldn't put a billionth of a Bitcoin on modern monetary theory.
You wouldn't?
Right? But just
Oh
for
boy!
start.
Oh my! Okay, why not?
No, I just well, it's not modern. It's like the old fashioned. It's like 1960s with a little dusting, a little sprinkle of modern computer and modern algebra on it. But I think it's it's not modern, and it's not monetary, and it's not theory. So, but that's another thing. But I think so. But that's a longer conversation. We could do that on another occasion. Um, I think so. Growth makes, if we could, so it's an interesting question. Um, People sometimes ask, well, didn't we lower emissions during the pandemic? We had much lower emissions of CO2 and other pollutants, and the sky was clear, and you could see the stars and all that. I said, well, yeah, that's true, but is that the way you want to do it? I mean, you can actually, if you really want to lower emissions, go back into the cave. Let's live kind of Stone Age existence. But that's not the idea. It's vastly inefficient. You're killing, you're killing tens of millions of people, and you're sickening people, and you're making them depressed and anxious, and they can't travel, and they're so upset. Is this really the way you want to do it? No, that's not the way. That's a route to political failure, in my view. If you want to do something like that, it's very, very expensive, and not the way to do it. The way to do it is by doing it gradually, efficiently, in the places where there are low-hanging fruit, which is a lot to do. So that's one part. Now you might ask, okay, so should we grow slower? Well, maybe that's a kind of corollary of that. Maybe the pandemic is like slow growth. Well, maybe should we grow faster? Or we should grow slower. Well, I think the problem is when people hear growth, they think of cancer, but they shouldn't. That's not the way to think of growth. The way to think of growth is you have better shelter, you have food for people, you have education for people, you have healthcare for people. That's what you're talking about. You're not talking about some cancerous cells growing outside our houses, and that's good. But we need to devote some of that to making sure it's clean growth and green growth, and that is going to require more resources devoted to things like clean power, clean industry, less polluting cars, low carbon technologies. They're not free. They're not super expensive, but they might cost us, depending on different numbers, over the long next 30, 40 years, 2, 3, 4% of our output. But that's like 2, 3 years growth. So the main thing we have to do is we have to do it efficiently and effectively. That's the real key to undertaking these kinds of steps.
And is nuclear power in your equation?
I think nuclear power is vastly safer than coal. I mean, let's get clear about that. It's vastly safer than coal. It's if you omit the greenhouse gases, it's probably about the same as natural gas. I don't know about it. Solar and wind are completely different animals. But the main point about nuclear power is that it has no carbon emissions, and so it really is one of the options we have. And the other one, it's the only option we have now that can provide reliable baseload power, as opposed to seasonal and diurnal variation in the power. Now, but the real problem is I mean, most people say, "Oh, it's not safe. It's not safe," and that's true. It's people say it's not safe. It's not true. It's not safe. But the main problem is it's expensive, and it's just way, way more expensive than other technologies
because of regulation.
So if nuclear is going to be in our future, it's got to be much cheaper.
It's expensive because of regulation, or just inherently expensive? Both.
Well, it's expensive because we want to make it safe, right? If it's sort of like if you have a philosophy, basically zero risk in nuclear power. Zero being, 10 to the minus a large number risk, very, very unlikely. 3 Mile Island every 100 years or something, or every 1,000 years.
But no one died there.
No Chernobyls ever. Well, I'm just saying, if that's your, yeah, so that makes the point. It's super safe. And so if that's, and we're now safer than we were in 3 Mile Island. The regulations are tougher. And they're so tough that they're too expensive to build a plant. So it's a trade-off, and we have different trade-offs in different areas. The trade-offs on the highways, we kill people on the highways all the time. We're much safer in the airplanes are super safe. Nuclear power is even safer. So if you're willing to do a little, allow greater risk in your nuclear power, it'd be less expensive. But at this point, not a lot less expensive. It's just the way we've designed it. These are expensive machines.
And give us your opinion on the Green New Deal. It's always associated with AOC, which is probably not good because she's fairly far left politically. So people at Fox News lose their minds when they hear Green New Deal. But what's the reality of it? And is it going to be that threatening to our economy, or how can we get around that?
Well, I think the Green New Deal is an aspiration, and it's actually largely about distributional politics and distribution of income. It's about jobs. It's about healthcare. There's a little bit about the environment in it, but it's basically a distributional New Deal more than a Green New Deal. On the green part, I think it's pretty backward in its design. There's no mention at all. I mean, it has a lot of talk about climate change. No mention at all about the international dimensions, which is a critical dimension. No mention at all about carbon pricing, which sort of all economists think is a key to making efficient policies. So I think it's not. I think it's not a serious set of policy proposals.
Yeah, again, I think one of the problems here is the politicization of the whole process. So, we're coming up on an hour here, and I know you have other interviews to do and so on. So, I guess I'm going to ask you to kind of, give us the pitch for why this is something that we should all be on board with. Why conservatives should also want to say conserve the environment. And here I'll use an analogy that if you define yourself by certain sacred values, like if I'm talking to a Christian about evolution and they're a creationist, I can't give them a choice between Darwin and Jesus because they're going to pick Jesus every time, right? So I try to take that off and go, maybe evolution's the way God created life or whatever. It's perfectly okay to accept the theory of evolution. You don't have to give up anything. So, and to conservatives, I try to say, look, climate science is real and so on. Global warming is real and human caused, but you don't have to give up your capitalist views and your belief in free markets. That's all fine, but then they go, but what? Well, then kind of the examples you've used and so on, that maybe there's a way to make a lot of money, profit from green technology and, be the next Elon Musk, and you want to save the planet environmentally and make a lot of money and change the world and so on. So kind of give us your pitch for why conservatives should be on board with all this.
Well, I think conservatives around the world, and by whether they're Burkean conservatives or people who like the traditional values and tradition, and like democracy and people having a voice and free speech and free association and a kind of Milton Friedman view of the role of personal and individual freedom and the way markets help that because they allow individual choice, and governments by necessity are coercive. So this is the traditional conservative view. You can't deny that there are public values and the public goods, that we have parks, we have common air, we have common climate, we have common values, we have common spaces, and we don't want to just auction those off. We don't want to just auction off Yellowstone or Central Park in New York to the highest bidder to build a bunch of Trump towers in them. I mean, that's not our vision of a good society. I think any of us, conservative or not conservative. So the question is how we're going to do that in an effective way that preserves the freedoms that conservatives think. And here is where I think conservatives are very much on board with the use of fiscal instruments for environmental policy, such as carbon taxes. And if I were a conservative, or when I put on my conservative hat, let's say, because I try to think of this in a non-political way, I'd say, I'd so much like to have a high carbon tax because I can get rid of all these other things. So it'll get rid of these light bulb regulations. I mean, really, do we need light bulb regulations in the good society? Get rid of all these other regulations, which are just, I'm talking as a conservative now, which are just hampering our personal freedoms, our institutional freedoms, our freedoms to invent and innovate. So what we need to do is we need to have powerful fiscal incentives to improve the environment. And with those, we can then have maximum freedom to innovate. And I'll just give one other really important point. A high carbon price, which is really the necessity if we're going to solve the climate problem, is a great incentive for innovation. Because if you have high carbon prices, then anyone who's looking at the automobile industry will say, wow, fossil fuels are the wave of the past, not the wave of the future. And what we really need to do is we need to deal with hybrids and electric vehicles, which are low carbon. Or similarly in power generation, to find low carbon forms of generation. It's a way of incentivizing the market to innovate, which is really the way we're going to solve these problems over the next half century or so. So that's my conservative hat, and I think that's very powerful. And I know some conservative, particularly economists, but also people like the late George Shultz was very much enamored of carbon taxes for just this reason, because they harness the market and they do it in a way that has a light governmental touch.
The light hand of government, I like that. And we do need some regulation for sure. I grew up in Los Angeles, and the air here in the 60s and 70s was just terrible, just awful. And I was a bike racer, and you had to be home by like 10 in the morning. Or else your lungs would just be fried. And then, the regulation and catalytic converters and all. Now the air is, just 100 times better. And life is better here because of that. And, just a little regulation is okay.
I think one of the really interesting environmental stories of the last 30 plus years is the use of pricing in sulfur, and how we have a system, a cap and trade system for sulfur, where the prices just really, it's moved down emissions just enormously over the last, much more rapidly than other areas in the United States. And it's been declining at about 10% a year for the last few years, much faster than anything you could, in the earlier era of the command and control regulations, or other countries. It's been a major success story, and I think largely because of this very, very powerful fiscal incentive that was given. That's the number one example that you'd use to promote carbon pricing.
Well put. Bill, thanks for coming on the show. Thanks for writing your book, and especially for your lifelong work on these important issues. There are solutions out there. I'm a big fan of innovation and technology, and the innovation of something like regulations like you're describing, carbon taxes. So that's a technology. It's a technology of moving people from one area to another area. Like they say, we didn't leave the Stone Age because we ran out of stones, right? We found better ways of living.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think we underappreciate institutional innovations. I mean, we love hard innovations like iPhones. That's the greatest. I would say that's the greatest innovation, or the smartphone, greatest innovation. 3.5 billion people around the world have smartphones. It's amazing how it's taken over. But I think something we don't appreciate as much is institutional innovation, how we've invented things over time, institutions of our democracy, institutions of free speech, institutions of the market, institutions. And the one that I am particularly interested in is the institution of using fiscal incentives to improve the environment. And that's something that you won't get a patent for, you won't get anything for, maybe, but it's something that actually is very, very powerful institutional innovation. And I think we should celebrate those as well.
Absolutely. Those are technologies. Well, you can win a Nobel Prize, maybe. You did. That's worth something.
Thanks, Michael.